hey, Pavel, you're a fleet owner. You started out as a driver. Like, what keeps you up at night? And as we were cycling through this list, we got to compliance. He started talking to us about compliance. Usually when someone talks about compliance, everybody falls asleep. We were like fascinated because it became really clear to us that compliance is a data problem. And data problems are problems that technology is really good at addressing. So we kind of double clicked on that and became obsessed with like reading FMCSA regulation books, going super deep on like, lawsuits that have involved trucking companies, how commercial automotive liability insurance gets structured, how that's dependent on your compliance and safety, how safety scores get calculated, how the FMCSA regulates all these things, how those regulations get applied in the context of a roadside inspection, how they get applied in the context of an audit, talking to people who had been FMCSA investigators and being like, hey, this is how it really works. Meeting with lawyers who defended trucking companies and understanding that piece of the equation, talking to folks on the insurance side and saying, how does compliance impact the way that you price your policies? But then, of course, critically spending a huge amount of time with trucking company owners and with safety managers, like sitting in the office with the safety manager, understanding how they do their job day to day. And we saw that this is a real problem. It's really hard. And someone needs to build great software to address that. And so that's what we ended up focusing on.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the FreightCaviar Podcast. Today's guest is Hunter Yaw. Did I pronounce your last name correctly? Is that Yaw?
100%. Perfect.
Hunter Yaw, the CEO and co-founder of LogRock, Inc. LogRock simplifies all the tedious work trucking companies do to comply with the FMCSA and DOT. Thanks, Hunter, for coming on the show. I hope I described LogRock. Oh, definitely. I hope I described LogRock correctly, but could you please introduce yourself and describe what problem LogRock is solving?
Absolutely. LogRock does the least sexy thing that human beings can possibly do. We build software to help trucking companies in the US stay compliant with federal and state regulations. And for those in the industry, they'll know that federal regulations really just means the Department of Transportation and the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, put a pretty substantial regulatory burden on trucking companies, which, on the one hand is understandable when you consider the importance of safety in trucking. But on the other hand, in terms of the day-to-day operations of a trucking company, it's a lot of work. So if you're a 30 truck fleet, there's about 1,090 documents that the FMCSA requires you to keep up to date, renew, stay on top of, and be able to share with them at any time they ask as part of an audit. If you're a 100 truck fleet, that goes up to 5,600 documents that you have to manage. And that's if you take a snapshot of the company at any given time. But when you consider how high driver turnover typically is, that number actually goes up because you've constantly got new drivers coming in, old drivers going out. You got to keep the records for the old drivers. You got to manage the records for the new drivers. The same with equipment and company filings and all these other pieces that you have to stay on top of. So we saw what a challenge that is for generally it's safety or compliance managers at the trucking company. If it's a fleet above 30, 40 trucks, that's probably a full-time role within the organization. It's a slightly smaller fleet. Sometimes it's someone who's doing that and other admin kind of back office work. But in either case, the task that those folks face is pretty daunting. Like it's just a huge amount that you have to stay on top of. And we realized there was no great digital purpose-built tool that had been designed for them specifically. So we decided to build that tool. That's what we offer, and constantly adding new features and growing and kind of building that out. But we have our core product live in market, have a bunch of paying customers who we're very proud to support, and grateful to be growing quickly and being able to offer it to more and more trucking companies.
Definitely, and thank you for the intro, Hunter. Before we get into the idea behind LogRock and more into the specifics of it, I do want to inform our listeners that we are both in Europe at the moment. I'm in Poland, and you are in Spain. We're in the same time zone. But before we talk about that, you're also currently residing in Brazil. Since you have a fascinating background, I want to kind of take it back to where it all began, like your time in logistics. If I am correct, you began your logistics career at LoadSmart in August 2017 as the product manager. Back then in August 2017, LoadSmart hadn't even raised a Series A. Can you tell us about what was your time like at LoadSmart? And then kind of take us through your responsibilities, your experience, and then eventually where you raised all that money at LoadSmart.
Absolutely, yeah. So when I started LoadSmart, maybe there were probably almost 20 people, 15, 20 people, something like that. It was a small team. Our office was on the third floor of a building with no elevator, and this like super crooked staircase that you were absolutely convinced that if you stepped on the wrong like step, the wood was just going to crack and you were going to like fall all the way through. The floor in the office was so crooked that if you didn't keep your hands on your desk, your chair would just roll to the other side of the office. And we had one bathroom, I think, for all like 20 people or something like that. So true kind of like, it wasn't a garage in Silicon Valley, but it was like, pretty close.
Sure.
And it was kind of the beginnings of the journey that LoadSmart took on the path to being a digital freight broker. And of course, there's the Convoys and the Ubers of the world that are, really well-known brands. The difference was that we didn't have any money. like small team, no resources, but we had a very, Ricardo and Felipe, especially the founders, who also, neither of them came from freight. Ricardo, grew up on the wrong side of the tracks in Colombia, got himself a scholarship to Georgia Tech. From there, went on to work at Goldman Sachs and was super successful at Goldman Sachs. And everybody thought he was absolutely bonkers for quitting Goldman Sachs to start a freight brokerage. They're like, what, dude, what are you doing? And then, Felipe's co-founder was a lawyer at a firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. He's super famous, like mergers and acquisitions guy, big shot lawyer. And they both quit, those jobs to get into freight brokerage. People thought they were crazy. I came to it from a 3D printing startup. And so I was kind of in like the New York tech scene, and you would go and hang out with your friends, your old colleagues. They'd be like, oh, what are you doing now? I'd be like, oh, I'm working for a trucking startup. And people like, you're doing what? Like, this is before supply chain tech was cool. Now you tell someone you work in supply chain tech and it's like, where can I invest? Like, what are you guys doing? Oh, that's amazing. It's super exciting. Like, I can't wait for my couch to get delivered. It's been 3 years. COVID broke the whole system. I'm like, yeah. Now you guys care. Now you guys care about logistics.
Yeah.
So it was, it was a very different time, but we were focused very specifically on digitizing, basically building a pricing algorithm that could create an instantly bookable spot quote for shippers, and then finding a way to have the shippers TMS, the system that shippers are using to coordinate their freight movement, automatically request that price from our system, and for our system to be able to send it back. So if you think about the typical process of a shipper requesting a spot quote, they got to pick up the phone or send an email to a broker. Someone, on the brokerage side, the account manager, whoever's talking to that shipper, gets that quote. Then they got to talk to the carrier sales guys, be like, hey, do we have capacity on this lane? What's the rate for that? Carrier sales guy's going to shout that back. And then either goes into the phone, goes into an email, gets back to the shipper. Maybe that's 15 minutes later, maybe that's 2 hours later, whatever. Our thing was to replace phone calls with API calls. So to do that, we invested in building out a really cool spot pricing algorithm that was able to generate an instantly bookable rate on any one of about 900,000 lanes in between 1 and 2 seconds. And then to build integrations with TMSs. So like, and now this has become a pretty common strategy, but we were the first to integrate with like Oracle and Blue Yonder and all those guys to be able to support primarily enterprise clients. So that, the Walmarts and Anheuser-Busch's of the world, but then over time also more kind of mid-sized shippers. So that was it. But yeah, when we started, man, it was, it was very different from what it is now. I think there's now like 700 people at LoadSmart. I started like 15 or 20 and crooked floor, broken staircase office. So yeah, it was an interesting journey.
Sure. So you ended up spending 3.5 years altogether at LoadSmart. You went from being the product manager to the vice president of product management, partnerships and marketing. You wore a lot of hats. What were like your main takeaways from that experience that I guess you took with you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think everyone at some point in their career should be part of a fast-growing business. Like you're absolutely right. I was there for 3.5 years, but Ricardo, one of the founders, and he used to say that working at LoadSmart is like dog years. So if it's like seven, it feels like 7 years for every one that you actually work there. So I felt like I was there for like 20 years. Because when I started the product team was me. They brought in around the same time Bosco, who was the CTO. He's now my co-founder at LogRock. And I think the whole product engineering team was like 6 or 7 people at the time, maybe, and by the time we left, that was 180. So in the space of those 3.5 years, we expanded that team just ridiculously. And in the meantime, the ops team, so, carrier sales and load ops and all those folks, that was maybe 15 people when we started. And now LoadSmart employs, so I don't know exactly how many at this point, but like several hundred.
Sure.
So that growth, was just crazy. I remember when we celebrated, the first month when we did $1 million in gross bookings, which for a freight broker is like not that crazy of an amount. And by the time I left, LoadSmart was doing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in bookings. So it was a very I think the main takeaway is that like it's awesome to be able to be a part of that crazy hyper growth experience, because it's not really like anything else. It's just not the same as working at a company that's kind of like gradually growing or kind of staying flat, because everything is breaking all the time. You know what I mean? Like it's just like that growth is like it's like a waterfall. It's just like this constant source of pressure, like banging on every possible surface. And any weak point is going to break, and that's going to happen like every day. And so to some extent you're running and kind of firefighting and filling in those gaps. But then on the other hand, you have to try to be on top of it to the extent that you're riding the wave and you're not just kind of in firefighter mode all the time. So like striking that balance and, oh my God, like this Fortune 50 shipper is threatening to fire us because we screwed up this load. Like, what are we going to do? And then you kind of like de-escalate that. And then it's like, okay, cool. But then how do we actually put a process in place so that doesn't happen again in the future? And then once you put the process in place, like, okay, cool. But how do we digitize more of that process so it doesn't require as many people and it can be more scalable and faster? Sure. And constantly like fighting those battles to go from like the waters above your head to the waters like just under your mouth to now like, okay, I feel like this kind of aspect of the business we've now kind of got under control. It's relatively digitized and scalable, and kind of repeating that while expanding and growing. It's a cool experience.
Yeah. And you've traveled and you've lived in many countries, Hunter. So you lived in the UK, you went to high school there, you graduated University of Oxford. Then you lived in Russia for a few years. Then you moved back to New York to work at LoadSmart, and they end up sending you to Brazil. Is that right?
That would be. I wish that was how it was. I'd be like, yeah, Ricardo stuffed me in a crate and exported me to Brazil. So listen, man. When we started, we were really struggling to recruit software developers, because we were based in New York, and companies that are hiring in New York, it's the Amazons and Googles of the world, and they're paying people a gajillion dollars. And again, this was before supply chain tech was cool. So you'd have a candidate, come in and be like, "Hey, so what do you guys do?" "Oh, we're in trucking tech." And the instant response is like, "I'm gonna go work. I'm gonna go work for Facebook. I'm good, thanks."
Sure.
And so we really struggling to recruit developers. And one of the co-founders of LoadSmart, Felipe, is Brazilian, and he's from an island in the south of Brazil called Florianopolis, or Floripa. So like Florida, but with a P instead of a D. And he basically said, "Listen, guys, like I've heard that my hometown, my home island, I guess, has kind of become like a tech hub in Brazil." And at the same time, they brought on Bosco, who's now my co-founder at LogRock. And Bosco started a company. He's like the classic, tech entrepreneur story. Like designed this algorithm while he was still in college. And then straight out of college, like went and built a business around the algorithm, which he then sold for a gajillion dollars to some big like publicly traded company in Brazil. So he was kind of one of the first really like successful Brazilian tech entrepreneurs, and he had a great reputation in the space. And he was sort of looking for his next gig because he'd sold his business and kind of wanted to figure out what to do next. And Felipe was like, have an international experience working for an American startup. And so he was able to get Bosco to come over. And Bosco was looking at this. He's like, well, how about instead of like failing to hire people for a gajillion dollars in New York, we succeed in hiring like great people in Brazil. And so that was a strategy. So, when I first went down to Floripa, we had, I think, 4 or 5 engineers. We were renting a single room in a co-working space, and there was one window, and the window faced, I swear to God, a graveyard. I was like, my first time in Brazil. Yeah, exactly. Well, the team made a lot of really bad jokes about deadlines. That was like my first time in Brazil, and I go into the office in the morning, like four guys, a window, and a graveyard. I'm like, okay. I had one of those, those like phone booths that they have in the office where you can do calls and stuff. They had one of those. Yeah. I had 2 calls back to back, and I was like halfway through the second one, and I realized I was going to pass out. I was like, no one had drilled air holes in this thing. It was when we started out, just like the office in New York, the office in Brazil was pretty low key.
Sure.
And man, but we were just able to find the most amazing people, developers, data scientists, designers, product managers, really, really bright people. A lot of people don't know that Brazil has a really, really strong public university system. And as part of that, they have really strong computer science faculties. And these days, if you learn to become a programmer, like you're going to speak English because you have to read things on GitHub and you watch stuff online. And so it's like, wait, there's these really, really bright, super well-educated folks who have really good English and are basically in the same time zone as the US, right? And because one of the co-founders, Felipe, is Brazilian and the other, Ricardo, speaks Portuguese, he lived in Sao Paulo, worked in Sao Paulo for a long time. There wasn't this sense that they were like the offshore, like, team that we'd hired in some country we'd never heard of because whatever, it was just like an easier, cheaper option. It was very much like a part of the culture, like the Brazilian, energy and culture and all of that was a big part of LoadSmart's culture. And so they felt connected to the business. We also critically gave everyone stock options, which at the time was pretty unusual in Brazil. People just like worked for their salary and that was it. You didn't get an ownership interest in the company. So the team felt very connected to the business, but for us, it just meant that we could hire so much faster and we could afford to hire so many more people. So yeah, that was started with those 4 or 5 people and it eventually became, I think by the time Bosco and I left, we probably had 160, 170 people working just in product engineering, design, data science in Brazil.
Sure. And what year did you move to Brazil?
So we moved to Brazil. My wife and I moved to Brazil in December of 2019. So I'm originally from New York, and all of my New Yorker friends now tell me that I can no longer call myself a New Yorker because if you didn't do COVID in New York, like you've lost your title. So we moved down in December of 2019. I don't know, man, kind of on a whim. It was like, we'd gone down a few times for work. A lot of those work trips just by accident ended up being at the same time as Carnival in Brazil. I don't know how it happened. It was some scheduling, some sort of, it just worked out that way. And we had so much fun every time we went, and it's amazing culture. People are super cool. And we just kind of fell in love with the place, and specifically, especially Floripa, the island itself. Like it's insane. If you ever have a chance, go visit. It's awesome. And it's like 1 million beaches, and it's super developed, super safe, super nice. People are very friendly. And now increasingly, there's actually a lot of international kind of tech people who work remotely who live from there because it's just it's nice and it's basically the same time zone as the US.
Sure.
So we were like, all right, you know what? Let's try living here for a while. And we did not think this through, man. Like we didn't figure out like at some point we'll probably need a visa. Like where are we gonna live? We're just kind of like booked an Airbnb for 2 weeks, gave up our apartment in New York, flew down to Brazil. We're like, we'll figure it out. And just when we were starting to realize like how little we had planned all of this, COVID hit and the Brazilian government, and we landed, so we'd been in New York for a couple of weeks. We flew back to Brazil and we landed in Brazil the day before the borders got shut.
Wow.
I remember we were flying out of JFK and I was like getting a beer before the flight. And that was when like the NBA started canceling games. And I remember watching that before getting on the plane. I was like, oh, this is getting real. When the NBA starts canceling games, like this is getting real. Someone's losing a lot of money. So this must be a real problem.
Sure.
And we landed and the next day they closed the border.
So you couldn't even leave.
We couldn't leave, but I think you could if they were like, if you want to go back, you go back. But they were super chill. They were like, if you want to stay, we understand that you don't want to travel. So you can stay for as long as you want. You don't need, like, you're not going to get in trouble. Like you're not overstaying your visa, whatever. You stay for as long as you want. And so we hung out there through all the lockdowns and whatever. And like, if there's ever another lockdown, I strongly advise you do it somewhere where there's a lot of beaches. Like it's much better.
Sure. Yeah.
We hung out there and then that was it, man. And we eventually decided we really liked it. So we bought a place. And then a year and a half ago, my wife and I had twins who are now, well, they're Brazilian, right? I mean, they were born there. So we feel kind of pretty connected to the place now.
Definitely. Fascinating stuff. But right now you're in Spain on vacation, right? That's
yeah. So my wife's parents built a house here. And one of the things about having twins is that like if you're gonna travel anywhere, you gotta have this whole like base of stuff that like moves with you. So I was like, all right, well, we're not gonna go like Airbnb hopping like we used to. It's gonna go somewhere. It's gonna be for a long time in one place with like a lot of space. And if it's covered in whatever food and diapers, then that's gonna have to be okay with everybody.
Totally.
You can't do it for a while.
You might be one of the most interesting people in the freight tech world right now that I've spoken to. It's cool.
Very nice of you to say.
You have a really cool background, and now you live on this Brazilian island. So cool. Hunter,
my goal is to sound as much as possible like a Bond villain. That's what now we need to have our office like inside a volcano on the Brazilian island, and then we like fully achieve that. Yeah.
One day.
One day.
Hunter, I do want to get back to LogRock. Since now you're the CEO and co-founder of LogRock. And last week you told me this amazing story about the whole idea about LogRock. And I remember I told you, I was like, crap, I wish we had recorded this because this would have been amazing. And you're like, no worries, Paul. I could totally do the same thing on the
I'll
podcast.
I'll pretend the conversation never happened. I'm gonna tell you like you've never heard this story before.
Perfect. Could you go over that story with all the details you talked about with me last week?
Absolutely, yeah. So I had left LoadSmart. I was asked to take over as the chief product officer of a big like marketing tech startup that was about to IPO out of New York. And so I was happily, kind of minding my own business working for them when Bosco, who had been the CTO at LoadSmart, kind of pinged me out of the blue and said, "Hey, Hunter, let's hop on a call." And I was like, "All right, sure." I figured, I don't know, maybe he needed like an introduction to someone or just wanted to check in or advice on something. I was like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." So I hopped on the call and Bosco was like, "Hey, I just quit LoadSmart and I think we should start a company together." I was like, well, all right. Everybody has that buddy, that calls you at like 10 o'clock on a Friday night and says, "Let's go for a beer." Bosco is not that guy. Like he's like the least impulsive person I've ever met. He's like everything in his life has like at some point an Excel spreadsheet and a table and like a structure and organization. And like, I was like, all right, Bosco, you're like a very organized, thoughtful person. So if you're suggesting this isn't like crazy on a whim, like I don't have to ask if you're sober right now or anything. Like what's the idea? And he said, listen, man, he said, "I don't have an idea." He said, I think this is a great time to start a company. And there's obviously a lot of opportunity in the supply chain space and like, let's do it. Like, all right. The thing is, man, and anyone who's worked in tech will probably have had this experience. The chief technology officer and the person who runs product are usually like at each other's throats, because the person who runs product is like, "I want to build this, I want to build that, I want to do this." And the chief technology officer is like, "Well, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough solutions, that's not even possible." Like, and there's this kind of like constant battle between I want to do everything and like we can't do any of that. And it can be a pretty like rough dynamic. And sometimes that's good for the company. It's a little bit like the balance between, like an account manager and a brokerage and the carrier sales guy. It's like, well, like take the freight, like, I can't find a truck for that. And it's like, kind of like, it's conflict. It can be constructive, but it can also like not be constructive, right? Depending on how it works out. But we had an amazing relationship. And like I said earlier, we built the team from like really small to basically huge. And you don't get to do that without kind of getting to know each other really well. I had just a huge amount of respect, not just for his background, because he previously founded and sold a business successfully, but also just for like, his skills and his network and all that good stuff. So I was like, all right, man, let's, if I'm ever going to do this, I wouldn't want to do it on my own. That would be my other advice to folks, like when possible, have a co-founder, because it just, it's a hard enough and lonely enough journey as it is. Sometimes it's very helpful to have someone who kind of balances you out. And Bosco always likes to say, if you drew a Venn diagram of our respective skill sets, the part in the middle would just be empty. Like, there's like nothing that we're both good at. We're kind of like, and you would think that wouldn't work, but actually it kind of does. So I was like, all right, let's explore this. So we started looking for ideas and trying to figure out what we wanted to do. And it felt to us like the shipper facing tech side was kind of crowded. Like there were a lot of people offering software to shippers, and what does Ryan Schreiber always say? Friends don't let friends TMS. So we're like, all right, well, whatever we do, let's not build a TMS. Fun fact, Ryan Schreiber, I think, actually owns the domain friendsdon'tletfriendstms.com.
He does.
Yeah. So that was like, I had that in the back of my mind. I was like, all right, well, whatever we do, no TMS. And so we thought, all right, well, what about building software for trucking companies? And like, there's a lot of people who've built software for trucking companies historically. A lot of that software has been terrible. And we thought, well, listen, like clearly there's opportunities there. Let's just kind of figure out where they are. But the one lesson that we took away from LoadSmart, we took a lot of lessons away from LoadSmart, but one of them was, if you're going to build a business in the freight space, but you come from a tech background, not from like a logistics operations background, you have to be really careful what you focus on, because there's so many aspects of the industry that still need people, that still need manual interaction, phone calls and emails, that if you pick a part of the business that's still very heavily dependent on that, you may have some technology, but you're also going to have a lot of people. And all of the digital freight brokers have had to struggle with that at some point. And anyone who works for a digital freight broker and tells you that they don't struggle with that is lying. So like, it's a tricky balance. And the thing is, neither Bosco nor I at that point, we'd worked for years in supply chain tech, and we were really excited to apply what we'd learned. But we also knew that we weren't, like day-to-day logistics operators. Like that just wasn't our strong suit. We're tech guys, we're nerds. And so like focusing on that was not a good idea. So we had to find a problem that could be attacked purely with technology, with software. And there's like not actually that many of them. It's kind of interesting. There are huge opportunities for technology in supply chain, but there's also huge areas of supply chain that aren't yet ready to be digitized. And if you think they are, you risk, losing a bunch of time and money and, stress going at that. So we had to pick really carefully. We cycled through a bunch of stuff. We looked at like parking and like driver recruiting and all these other, areas that are serious problems for trucking companies. But in each case, we either came to the conclusion that someone else was already doing it well, or that like we couldn't solve it purely with technology. And so we thought, all right, keep going. And finally, we were talking to a guy called Pavel Botev, who some folks may know. Pavel runs Logiflex, which is a fairly sizable, mostly hazmat trucking company out of Chicago. Pavel's awesome, American dream, moved to the US when he was young, had to support his mom and his younger sisters, started driving a truck. Now he's got 160 trucks, but super, super smart guy. And so I got to know Pavel through my time at LoadSmart. I actually bought a piece of software called Camion, which is a carrier TMS that he had built out of his company. So I kind of, for LoadSmart, bought that from Pavel, got to know Pavel well. So we reached out to him. We were like, hey, Pavel, you're a fleet owner. You started out as a driver. Like, what keeps you up at night? And as we were cycling through this list, we got to compliance. He started talking to us about compliance. Usually when someone talks about compliance, everybody falls asleep. We were like fascinated because it became really clear to us that compliance is a data problem. And data problems are problems that technology is really good at addressing. So we kind of double clicked on that and became obsessed with like reading FMCSA regulation books, going super deep on like, lawsuits that have involved trucking companies, how commercial automotive liability insurance gets structured, how that's dependent on your compliance and safety, how safety scores get calculated, how the FMCSA regulates all these things, how those regulations get applied in the context of a roadside inspection, how they get applied in the context of an audit, talking to people who had been FMCSA investigators and being like, hey, this is how it really works. Meeting with lawyers who defended trucking companies and understanding that piece of the equation, talking to folks on the insurance side and saying, how does compliance impact the way that you price your policies? But then, of course, critically spending a huge amount of time with trucking company owners and with safety managers, like sitting in the office with the safety manager, understanding how they do their job day to day. And we saw that this is a real problem. It's really hard. And someone needs to build great software to address that. And so that's what we ended up focusing on.
I love that story. And it's just so smart to actually go to the trucking company and see what problem they're facing. Because a lot of companies these days come up with an idea, they think it's great, and they go raise money, and then they ended up burning all of it because it's not either not needed or it's just the industry's flooded with solutions for it. So
yeah, if you lock enough tech guys in a conference room, they will come up with an idea for a business. Sure. And they'll find a way to pitch it to investors. And unfortunately, in the supply chain space, a lot of folks have historically tried to do that without actually spending much time interacting with the folks who are in the industry day to day. And it's something, man, like we're very conscious of. Like every day, everything we do, we try to be, I'm not sure if humble is the right word, but like respectful of the fact that like I have now driven a truck. Pavel let me drive his truck around his yard a few times, which is amazing. But like I've never been paid to be a truck driver, right? And I think being honest about that, being aware of that, and being, maybe humble is the right word. Being like, there's a lot that we don't know and we don't understand. And as technologists, yes, there is value we can add to the industry, but being just another person who comes in and goes, oh, have you seen the UX or the interface on that TMS? Like it's ugly. These people have no idea what they're doing. And like assuming that everybody who's worked in logistics and like kept the entire country moving for, decades has no idea what they're doing. They're really stupid and they can't operate a computer. It's not good. It's not good business. It's not a good idea. Like those are your customers, man. But like the amount of people on the tech side that you'll hear kind of like, oh, the interface is terrible. The software is awful. These guys are dinosaurs, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know what? They're making it work somehow. And a lot of them are making a lot more money than you are. So like,
exactly.
chill for a second, right? And maybe like have some respect.
I hear that all the time.
Condescending. Yeah, it drives me nuts, man. It drives me nuts. And I'll have people reach out and be like, oh, I'm thinking of starting a company because look, these like they're still faxing each other. Yeah, they are. And are there opportunities? But don't come at it from the perspective of like, these people have no idea what they're doing. I'm going to go fix their industry for them. Come at it from the perspective of like, let me see if I can help, and if I can, how, and do that in a way that you're actually adding value and not just like thinking I'm going to become the next Mark Zuckerberg by teaching these truckers how to like operate computers. Like it's super condescending. It's not respectful. And I call that out because it happens. Unfortunately, it's a thing. So we were very conscious of not being that guy or not being those guys. Because I think it's not a path to success for anybody. You're not going to benefit your customers, and ultimately your business probably isn't going to succeed. So yeah, we're very, very conscious of that.
Sure. So you come up with this idea and you go out and raise money. Can you tell us about like the experience of raising? Was this your first time raising money?
It was my first time raising money as a founder. So I was
Okay.
involved with fundraising at LoadSmart, where I would I was involved with meeting with potential investors, presenting the product, helping them understand the business. For sure, Ricardo and Felipe had a gajillion times more experience in that than I did, the co-founders of LoadSmart. And I remain extremely grateful to them for a lot of things. One of those things was that they kind of let me in on that process so that I could see from the inside how the sausage is made. And let me tell you, there are very few things that are more surreal than the process of raising. Well, in that case, we were raising tens of millions of dollars. The round that I was involved in ultimately ended up being an $85 million round, which is just surreal, right? You coming from the outside, like this is and we become kind of immune to this stuff because you read about it in the news every day, and like this guy, Jeff Bezos is worth this much. Like, at the end of the day, $85 million is an insane amount of money. So you kind of like you have to kind of get used to it. But how does that money move? Because of a meeting, because of a Zoom call, because of a deck, because of a model and something you said, and then something clicks with the investor, and he's like, here's I'm backing this now. Here's your $15 or $20 million check. And then another bunch of people come chasing in behind because they're not really sure what they're doing, but they trust the other investor. So like, well, if he's in, then I'm in. And the next thing you know, like one day you have nothing, and then the next day it's all done, and you're like, well, how? After 3 months of worrying, like, is this ever gonna happen? Like, are we gonna go out of business? And then suddenly you've got $80 million in your bank account. It's like, this is the weirdest thing ever. Fundraising is a weird process. But in our case, listen, I mean, Bosco and I wanted to bootstrap it. Our original thing was, let's each put in some cash, and let's hire some people and build this thing, kind of from scratch. And everyone we talked to was like, guys, it's not how this works anymore. It's 2021. What you need to do is put together, a deck and go out and raise $3 to $5 million. And again, for me, that was like, it felt surreal, like based on what? But we were very fortunate. This has nothing to do with us and everything to do with the financial markets, the investor market, the capital markets at the time. Last year, as everybody knows, were just crazy, like huge checks, very fast decisions, and just a lot of money flying all over the place. And to be blunt, like we were very lucky. We like, it's like the movies when the guy like slides in under the door right before it closes. Like we were very lucky to raise a bunch of money right before doing that became a lot harder. And so, but we started, and I'll give a shout out, I think in particular to our lead investors. It's a fund called Dynamo, who are out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And, Dynamo are super cool guys. All they do is seed stage supply chain investments. Like that's it. They don't invest in anything that isn't seed stage, and they don't invest in anything that isn't supply chain. They'll do follow-on investments after the initial one, but they're not like, oh, here's this cool company that's about to go public, let's go invest like $50 million in them. Like they bet on you at the beginning. And that takes a lot of conviction, because Bosco and I went to them with a PowerPoint presentation. That was it. We didn't have a single line of code. We didn't have a single customer. We had a deck and an idea. And they're basically betting on, to some extent, they're betting on the idea, and in a lot of ways, they're betting on you, right? And being like, well, I hope this, this person, these people don't screw this up. And so, we really, I think the process became, for us, it felt a lot better once we got connected with them. They were super transparent. There were no games. And they like very quickly showed a lot of conviction in us and in our idea. They're like, we think this could be great. Like, we'd love to support you guys. Let's figure out. Of course, you have to hammer out the details, and there's lawyers and documents and valuations and negotiating over all sorts of crazy stuff in terms that you've never heard before. But ultimately, it was a great experience, I think, because we got to do it with them. And then they were joined by a fund called QED, who are out of Virginia. And the reason I keep mentioning these guys are from Tennessee and Virginia is that they are not from Silicon Valley or from New York.
Sure.
And I think that was also part of the equation for us. Was one of the things I like about QED is funded by the guys who built Capital One. What's in your wallet guys. So they originally built Capital One, which is a pretty amazing business. Like they were basically came in out of nowhere, the Visas and the MasterCards of the world, and they were like, hey, let's use a bunch of data and do this in a really smart way. And we're extremely successful, obviously, doing that. And then they went on to now start investing in other startups and companies. But one of their rules is that if you want to work there as an investor, you have to have worked in tech. You can't just be like, I'm a finance guy. Like you have to have actually built technology businesses yourself. And so the partner there, Matt, who we worked with, had operating experience in a senior role in lots of different tech companies. So again, they became a great partner. So we were lucky, man, that, it was at a time when it was a lot easier to raise than it is now, to be honest. And you read about that and like, it's true. But also we were very fortunate to find investors that were it wasn't like, crypto, Web3. Yeah. These are like very down to earth people who are like either deep experts in supply chain like Dynamo is, or like are operators and who've run businesses like the QED guys are. And they were joined by 9Yards, which is another fund that we're great fans of. For anyone who's looking to get involved in supply chain tech or invest, Daniel Jaffe at 9Yards is awesome. So they were involved as well, and we just kind of put it together, man, like that. And at the end of the day, it's got to be people you can trust. It's got to be people you like working with, you like talking to. It can't just be about the money. And I know that's a cliche, is like value beyond capital and all this stuff. Sure, but once you take the money, then like you owe something to these people. You owe something to their investors. Like if you don't feel a strong sense of like responsibility, then that's a problem, right? So you should feel like they've bet on you, and now you've got to you got to live up to that promise, that potential you got to deliver. So you want those to be people that you enjoy working with, because things are going to go wrong along the way. And one of the things I later learned, I was like, why are they not that concerned about the product or like the specifics of how it's going to look or exactly how we're going to sell it? I was like, it's weird that people aren't asking about that. What I learned later is because they know that the thing about startups at this stage is that that's going to change 100 times, right? So like
Sure.
they can't bet on that, because it's not like, oh well, I like this like interface for this particular feature and this button, I think that's a great idea. No, because that's ultimately you're going to build that and then you're going to realize that that's a terrible idea because of X, Y, and Z. You delete that and you do another version, right? And by the time it actually gets into market, it probably looks nothing like what you said originally it would. Like if I look back now at our investor deck, and we're like, that's hilarious. We were wrong about half of that, right? So it's like, and they know that because they've done this before, right? So they're backing a team and to some extent an idea rather than the specifics, but you got to live up to that, right? And then you have that kind of sense of responsibility. But it has to be people you want to then have those conversations with, because there are going to be hard times. You're going to have to explain like, why isn't this working? Or why isn't that working? Why do you have to fire this person? Yeah, there are going to be challenges if you think there aren't, you're kidding yourself, right? So it's got to be people you want to be in that foxhole with, which is I think another important thing for folks to think about if you're ever out there and doing that. Don't take money from someone just because it's a famous fund or because the terms are really good. If it's not a person you want to have to talk to when things are not going well, then don't take their money.
Sure, great advice. So Hunter, can you tell us about how LogRock could potentially reduce a trucking company's insurance costs? And what is like your sales pitch when you speak to a safety manager of a trucking company?
Yeah. So when we're talking to safety managers, it almost feels like we don't have to sell because like safety managers know how hard this is. Like you don't have to convince them that their job is almost impossible. They know that already. And I think being a safety manager it's a hard job. And a lot of the conversations, the interactions that you have to have with people are not super like positive and happy. It's like, hey, this driver's got to come off the road because his CDL is about to expire. We got to like get him to the DMV. Hey, this driver's got to come off the road because he's got to go do drug and alcohol test. Hey, this piece of equipment is missing an inspection report. Where is that? Did you lose it? Like, do you have it? If not, go do it. And again, then that asset's got to come off the road. Like, the conversations they're having with dispatchers, with drivers, with mechanics, with the owner. A lot of the time, it's that there's a problem that they're bringing to them, and now someone's got to go, do something they don't want to do to solve that problem. But the work they do is critical, right? It's essential to the trucking company. So when we go to them and say, listen, we've purpose built a tool just for you. Like we've spent months going super deep in the workflow of a safety manager, and we've built really cool software to make your job easier, to make you more productive, and to reduce the risk of mistakes. And given how costly those mistakes can be, if you get audited by the DOT, if God forbid post-accident you get dragged into a lawsuit, that's where nuclear verdicts are born, right? Nuclear verdicts come from someone missing a piece of paper, because then the guys on the other side, these like ambulance chasing, or I guess truck chasing lawyers in court, are going to be like, look, they weren't inspecting their trucks. They were missing this, they're missing drug tests for this driver. They didn't even have this guy's background check, right? They were negligent. They didn't take this seriously. These trucks out on the road are like weapons, and they're going to kill you and your family. And that's it, man. You're done. And the way that they prove that is by finding a document here, a piece of paper there that was missing, that wasn't kept up to date, and then present that as you being negligent. So the risks are huge, but the work is really hard. And so we built the system to help them. So when we're talking to safety managers, like they get it immediately, and they love LogRock, and they're ultimately our users, right? The folks that are using the software day to day are safety and compliance people, and they absolutely love it. And if you talk to them, they'll tell you it makes their life a lot easier. When it comes to reducing costs, I think that's a critical piece. And we focus on that, especially when we talk to owners, because trucking company owners, understandably, a lot of their job is being really careful about where the company spends its money. Trucking, people look at it like, whoa, trucking company makes that much money. It's still a relatively low margin business. Like you have to be really careful, really smart on your costs in order to be making money. in the market, the way it's been the last couple of years, that was easier, but that's changing now, right? The markets are cooling, and you got to be super smart and super thoughtful about where you spend your money. So when we go to owners, sometimes they're like, oh, another piece of software, another tool that I've got to subscribe, and pay for. And we make our tool very affordable, and there's no long-term subscription. You can cancel anytime if it's not adding value. So that helps because they see that, okay, these guys aren't trying to lock me into some like 1 year, 2 year contract that I can never get out of, and for a product that I hate. So like, it's helpful that we make it affordable. It's helpful that we don't ask for a long-term commitment. So if you don't like it, you can cut us out at any time. But we still need to show them how we're going to add value to their business at a time when it's critical for them to get their costs down. And when they think about compliance, they often don't think about savings. They think about cost. They think about the cost of having, safety managers, and the cost of, having to have all this paperwork and all these documents, all that. The reality is that compliance actually can being on top of your compliance can save you a huge amount of money. So one of those areas, as you mentioned, is insurance. Commercial automotive liability insurance. So the liability insurance that you have to have in case your truck gets into an accident, and then there's some sort of liability that kind of comes into play post-accident, which unfortunately is happening more and more every day, is really expensive. For like a mid-sized fleet, they're probably paying like $9,000 to $10,000 per year per truck. It's a lot of money just for their liability insurance policy, right? And that's not money that's like generating freight. That's not money they're putting in the driver's pockets so the driver can then go operate the vehicle and generate revenue for the company. No, that's just like paying for your insurance policy. Like that's just money's just out the door, right? And you have to spend it because you have to have the policy. So it's incredibly expensive. And those costs have gone up 50% in the last 10 years. So on a per mile basis, 10 years ago, you spent about 6 cents per mile on your liability insurance. Now it's about 9 cents per mile. That's a lot. That's a big part of the trucking company's cost. But if you talk to the insurance companies, what they'll tell you is that trucking companies that are on top of their compliance spend about 8.5% less on their liability insurance. Now, is that 50%? Is that 70%? No, but 8.5% of $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 per truck scaled across your entire fleet, that's real money, right? And the reason that they spend less is because the insurance company sees fewer risks, because the insurance company's nightmare is that you become one of those nuclear verdict stories that we read about where the jury awards, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars against the trucking company. Guess who's paying that money? A lot of it is the insurance company, right? And they're not going to go bankrupt. They can't avoid that. You can be like, oh, I declare bankruptcy, I liquidate my MC. It's still an awful experience for the trucking company owner to have to go through all that. But for the insurance company, that's a huge loss. That's like a crazy amount of money that's just gone. They have to pay that. It's a huge loss. So for them, avoiding that risk is really, really important. And they know that the trucking companies that are on top of their compliance, where all the paperwork, all the documents, all that data is in place, and where their driver logs have been properly audited, and there's no gaps in their compliance armor, those are the companies that those truck chasing lawyers are going to skip, because they're going to take a look at them and be like, there's nothing here. I can't like sink my teeth into these guys. Like they don't have a weak spot. And there's so many trucking companies out there that do, that it's not worth my time chasing these guys. I'm going to go find the, it's like the, whatever, you watch those nature documentaries where the lion's like looking for the slow antelope. Like they're going to skip the fast one. There's enough antelopes out. They're going to find the slow one, right? So don't be the slow one, right? And I think that's, for insurance companies, they're like, if these guys are on top of this, they present less risk for me, which means there's less likelihood that I'm going to lose a huge amount of money. Sure. But the interesting thing is that usually trucking company owners only talk to their insurance broker. They don't talk so much to the insurance company, they talk to the insurance broker. The insurance broker may not be telling you that because they're trying to sell, and there's other stuff that's going on, right? So we try to get that information in front of owners that, listen, you can spend less on your insurance if you're on top of your compliance. Another piece of the puzzle is driver retention. Trucking companies that have great safety scores have 7% lower driver retention. Now, again, is that like 90%? No, but it's a meaningful piece because it costs about $9,500 to replace a driver when you consider the cost of bringing them into the office, travel expenses, background checks, medical, all that stuff, plus the cost of the empty asset that's sitting in your yard, still incurring, all those payments and insurance and everything, but it's just sitting there, right? It costs a lot of money to lose a driver. But the thing is that if you want to hire the best drivers want to work for the best trucking companies. And a lot of folks will tell you, if they work in driver recruiting, good driver candidates will ask for your MC number, and they're going to go onto the FMCSA website and they're going to check your safety scores, and they're going to check your compliance scores, and they're going to see what kind of operation is this, because they know that if you have gaps in your compliance armor, they are going to get pulled over and inspected more often, because the state police that are running these weigh stations and these scale houses are using software that's powered by the DOT. And the DOT, with all those safety scores, is determining which trucks have to get pulled over and inspected and what level of inspection, right? Because there's like 3 levels of inspection. One is much more serious. The other is quicker. So how deep is the inspection and how often are you getting inspected depends mostly on the trucking company, because the DOT is like, oh, this guy is hauling for this company, that I'm worried about this company, so we're going to inspect him. But the problem for the driver is that anything that gets uncovered during that inspection, that's going on his record as well as the company record. And the driver does not need that, right? So drivers want to work for trucking companies that have great compliance, because they don't want to be working, they don't want to be hauling for a company that's prioritized, which means they're constantly going to get inspected. They're going to lose a bunch of time. And of course, if a cop follows you, when you're driving your own car all day, every day, sooner or later, they're going to find something. Same, if you're constantly getting pulled over for an inspection, sooner or later, someone's going to come up, and that's going to go on your record. And now that stays with you even if you leave the company. So the best drivers want to work for companies that are on top of their compliance, because they know they're going to get inspected less. So driver recruiting costs, insurance costs, these are hard, real costs that trucking companies incur every day. And if you're better on your compliance, those costs are going to be lower. So we make that clear to owners, because a lot of owners don't necessarily think about it that way. But when they see it that way, they realize that the cost of improving your solution by having a better tool to be on top of compliance is a great investment, because the savings on the other side of that, when you reduce your insurance costs, you reduce your driver turnover, are huge. They're really meaningful. So that we kind of try to get that message out there, because it's important for owners to understand that.
Totally. It's a great sales pitch, because you definitely bought me into it. If I had a trucking company, I'd be all over this.
We're just missing one piece in that equation. We just got to get you some trucks. Yeah, I know a guy, man. I know a guy.
It's actually a dream of mine that one day I have trailers that have FreightCaviar all over them, on the roads.
Would be awesome. That would be awesome. I want to be driving in from O'Hare to Chicago and see a FreightCaviar trailer. That's a snap I want to take.
Totally, it'd be really cool. So maybe one day. But Hunter, so if there's any listeners here that would be interested in learning more and get a demo, who could they reach out to?
Reach out to me. My email is hunter@logrock.com. Come to our website, logrock.com, or send us an email at letsrock@logrock.com. But yeah, easiest way is come to the website, take a look, logrock.com. And if you like what you see, feel free, you can sign up for a demo there, right on the website, or shoot me an email anytime. I'm always happy to hear from anyone in the space, the industry. My email is just hunter@logrock.com.
Awesome. Hunter, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on the FreightCaviar podcast. You're a fascinating guest, and thank you so much for taking your time.
We are big FreightCaviar fans, man. So this was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate that. Thanks for tuning in to the Daily FreightCaviar podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, or if you didn't, leave a review. Let me know what you think. I appreciate any feedback. If you'd like to have more FreightCaviar content, go to freightcaviar.com and subscribe to my email newsletter.